I realise that the question posed in the title of this video was somewhat ambiguous. You should mind the gap because otherwise you could fall under a train, and this is something your doctor would not recommend as a lifestyle choice. But what I meant was, why is there a gap in the first place? Mind the gap is practically the London Underground's catchphrase. It's automatically announced at several stations that you should mind the gap between the platform and the train. A few people have asked recently, both in the comment section of recent videos and in real life, why on earth you would have a gap in the first place. I mean, in some places that gap is very wide indeed. It doesn't seem safe at all. Seems like a fairly significant design flaw, in fact. There are basically two kinds of gap. The kind caused by curves in the track and the kind caused by height differences between the train and the platform. If you're a regular viewer of this channel, you may have anticipated my initial answer. It's all to do with the age of the tube network and the way it was built. Historically, wherever possible, underground lines used to be built to follow the alignment of the streets above. Look at any map app that shows you both the streets and the underground lines, and you can see this very clearly. There were two reasons for this. One was that the lines followed the routes that people typically used to commute. But the far more important reason was money. In the early days, lines were built using the cut and cover method. This involved digging a trench, laying the track and covering it over. And that meant a lot of disruption in the streets above. Whenever the line had to pass under a building, they'd have to buy that building up and demolish it, along with the associated legal mumbo-jumbo. So by sticking to the line of the roads wherever they could, the number of buildings they'd have to pay for would be minimised. When the district line was being built, they swiftly found themselves running out of money because their route could not avoid demolishing a lot of expensive property. In 1890, the first deep-level tube line opened, the City and South London Railway. This was built far below street level and therefore did not need to demolish much of anything up above. But it still followed the line of the roads. That was because, even though they weren't going to be knocking things down, they did have to pay easement for every building they passed under. There was also the fact that nobody really knew what would happen with these deep-level tubes long-term. There were plenty of experts convinced that the new trains would vibrate the buildings up above to the ground. Actually, vibration was a problem with the first Central Line trains, but that was resolved with new rolling stock. Anyway, following the line of the streets is not ideal from the point of view of building stations. The streets in the City of London date back in some cases to the Roman era. They're often winding and illogical, based upon paths taken by people and animals thousands of years ago. There had been attempts to fix this. Following the Great Fire of London, Sir Christopher Wren proposed a more logical grid system. But landowners told him where he could stick it and went right back to those ancient cattle trails. All this is a very roundabout way of saying that tube stations often had to be built on curves. But tube carriages are not curved unless something has gone very wrong, so the result is large gaps when they come into the station. This is particularly noticeable at Bank on the Central Line. Later lines avoided the worst of this, but there are other engineering reasons why you might have to build your station on a curve. Perhaps you need to avoid something else that's underground with you, or you need to change direction. But on the whole, newer stations have less extreme gaps, if any at all. Now, the question of height differences. I suppose these are more like steps than gaps, but, whatever. Ideally, with tube trains, level boarding is the goal. It's good for people with mobility issues, it's good for people with pushchairs, it's good for people with luggage, it's good for visually impaired passengers, it's just good all round. And even back in the Edwardian era, underground stations were built with the aim of as close to level boarding as they could get. Underground Electric Railways of London, who built much of the network at that time, believed that level boarding would save precious seconds, all of which would add up. But over the course of the 20th century, complications arose. New rolling stock came in that didn't necessarily conform to the same dimensions as the old. The ownership of lines changed. You have almost certainly noticed that trains on the London Underground come in two different sizes. There are the larger subsurface trains, which have similar dimensions to conventional trains on the main line network. And then there are deep-level tube trains, designed for use in narrow tunnels and therefore much smaller. Being smaller, their floors are lower. Stop me if I'm going too fast for you. As I say, the ownership of some lines changed over time, and this in turn changed the kinds of trains that were being used. For instance, many of the Piccadilly line stations were originally designed for District line trains. Many of the current Central line stations were built for main line services. And sometimes deep-level trains found themselves sharing platforms with other trains, like on the Overground line to Watford Junction or on the Piccadilly line to Uxbridge. In these cases, you had trains designed for much lower platforms using the stations, resulting in a trip hazard between the train and the new platform. Sometimes, where it was economically convenient, the stations were rebuilt. In the case of the Piccadilly line stations that were rebuilt, they sometimes went for a halfway solution. A little higher than the Piccadilly trains, a little lower than the District. Otherwise, it was just a case of warning passengers to mind the gap. And this is the origin of the famous announcement, first heard in 1969 and still in use to this day. You may particularly wish to listen out for the announcement on the northbound platform of the Northern Line at Embankment, which still uses the old announcement by actor Oswald Lawrence. It's been kept for Mr. Lawrence's widow, who found it comforting to hear his voice after his death in 2007.
Mind the gap. Mind the gap.
Stuff like that is why I love the Underground. But announcements aren't going to cut it for passengers who need level boarding. For wheelchair users, there are portable ramps at tube stations, and many platforms have humps to provide level boarding areas. A much broader solution is being implemented on the Piccadilly line. New trains are on the way and upgrades are in progress. One of these upgrades involves relaying a lot of the old track, rerouting trains so there will be less platform sharing, and putting trains on a level with higher platforms. I dare say it will be a long time, though, before gaps on the Underground are truly a thing of the past. Well, I hope you enjoyed this spacious tale from the tube. If you did, I would be grateful if you could leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like, as ever, to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon for your generous support. You are the announcement to my trip hazard. And I'll see you all again very soon for another Tale from the Tube.